My name is Elena. I always believed in small joys, the ones you hold close when the world feels too heavy, too loud. For me, it was the dress, a simple thing really. But in that blue satin was every soft promise my father ever made, every hope he left behind when he went away for good. It hung in my closet for months, a little flash of beauty in the daily gray. I'd run my fingers along the hem and imagine prom night, the way I'd twirl under the lights, my hair pinned up the way he liked, his memory pressed to my heart like a secret. My father had always called me his quiet star. I think that's what made it so hard for anyone to see how badly I wanted something as silly as a dress. I never learned to make demands, not in this house, not after he was gone. The silence settled in around me like a second skin, especially after my stepmother and her daughter moved in, filling the air with their sharp perfume and sharper words. They took over the house with laughter that sounded nothing like joy, and footsteps that always seemed to find the softest places in my heart. Prom was my secret hope, the thing I counted down to in the back of my mind while I washed dishes or folded towels. It wasn't just a dance, not to me. It was proof that something of me, something gentle and bright, could survive here, in the quiet after dinner. I would slip away to my room and try the dress on, standing in front of the mirror, pretending just for a moment that I belonged somewhere, that I was seen. The morning it all changed started like any other. The sky was a faded gray, sunlight pressing half-heartedly against the window. I remember humming as I brushed my hair, thinking about the soft curls I'd pin in place that evening. I reached into my closet, expecting the cool brush of satin against my knuckles. Instead, my hand met empty air. I checked again, pushing hangers aside, blinking as if I could force the dress to appear. It was gone. A hollow sort of panic began to grow in my chest. I found my stepmother in the hallway, a little too cheerful, her voice pitched high like it always was when she was hiding something. "Looking for something?" she asked, her smile all teeth, and no warmth. My stepsister stood behind her, shifting from foot to foot, and in her arms my dress. She laughed, holding it up to herself. The blue fabric suddenly rung on her frame. My stepmother reached out, smoothing the dress over her daughter's body, and told me, almost sweetly, "It looks better on her anyway. She needs it more. She'll make better use of it than you ever could." I wanted to speak. I really did. There was a thunderstorm building inside me, a desperate need to scream, to shout, to demand justice. But the words stuck in my throat, strangled by years of learning to be quiet, learning to shrink myself so I wouldn't take up too much space. I nodded, numb and cold, as they walked away, my stepmother's laughter trailing behind her like a knife twisting in my gut. I watched them disappear down the hall, my dress trailing after, and felt smaller than I ever had before. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, invisible and unheard. My stepsister twirled in front of the mirror practicing her smile, while my stepmother fussed over her hair. I could hear them through the thin walls, their excitement another language I wasn't allowed to speak. No one asked where I'd be that night. No one wondered if I had other plans. I didn't. I sat on my bed, knees hugged to my chest, staring at the empty space in my closet and wishing with everything I had that I could disappear. Sometimes I think pain is loud and dramatic, but most of the time it isn't. Most of the time, it's quiet, a slow ache that settles deep inside you and makes you question whether you ever mattered at all. I spent hours replaying my father's voice in my head, the way he'd promised I was strong, the way he'd believed in a future for me even when I couldn't see one for myself. I clung to those memories as the sun set, painting the room in soft blue shadows that reminded me of the dress I'd lost. I wanted to hate my stepmother and stepsister, to let the anger burn away the sadness. But all I felt was tired of being the outsider, tired of losing the things that mattered most. I pressed my face into my pillow and tried not to cry, afraid that if I started, I might never stop. The night passed slowly, and with every hour, the house grew quieter. I heard the door slam as they left for prom, laughter echoing down the empty halls. I listened until the sound faded, leaving only silence behind. I let myself imagine, just for a moment, that somewhere out there my father was watching, that he saw my pain, that he knew I was still here surviving, even when it felt impossible. I promised myself I would get through this. I promised myself I wouldn't break. No matter how badly they wanted me to, I was his quiet star after all. And even on the darkest night, I had to believe I could find my way back to the light. The morning after prom, I woke to a house filled with new silences and old resentments. The walls seemed thinner, every sound sharper. I could hear my stepmother's heels clicking on the kitchen tiles. The bright scrape of laughter as she recounted the night to anyone who'd listen. My stepsister slept in, her shoes abandoned at the door, the blue satin dress tossed carelessly over a chair creased, stained with makeup, no longer something magical or rare. Seeing it like that, so casual and forgotten, stung deeper than I expected. I busied myself with the dishes, the only thing I could control. The water ran hot, burning my hands. But I welcomed the sting it gave me something to focus on besides the dull ache in my chest. Every plate I washed, every cup I dried. I thought about the way my father used to slip into the kitchen on quiet mornings, humming under his breath, his large hands careful with every movement. He treated small things with such gentleness. He treated me with gentleness, too. Those days felt impossibly far away now, like a story I had told myself so many times I couldn't remember what was real and what was wishful thinking. When my stepsister finally wandered into the kitchen, she looked at me like I was part of the furniture, useful, invisible, never truly seen. "You missed a good night," she said, not even trying to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "Everyone said I looked amazing. Mom says you should be grateful. The dress would have gone to waste on you." I forced a smile, the kind that makes your jaw ache because every muscle in your face knows it's a lie. I wanted to shout, to throw something, to demand an apology, but I knew it wouldn't matter. I'd learned long ago that in this house, there were only consequences for speaking up, never rewards. I just nodded, eyes on the sink, and let her words slide over me like cold water. My stepmother appeared, cup of coffee in hand, looking as rested as I'd ever seen her. She ran her eyes over me, assessing, then offered a thin, sharp smile. "You should help your sister with her things. She has a lot to do now that she's prom royalty." Her words twisted, each one carefully sharpened to a point. She didn't have to say it outright. In this family, my value is in service, in staying silent, in making their lives easier. That was my role, and I was expected to play it well. So I picked up the dress, still warm from my stepsister's body, and tried not to breathe in the scent of her perfume mixed with something sour, jealousy, maybe, or just the sour note of disappointment. My hands shook as I carried it upstairs, careful not to look too long at the stains. This was what was left to me, the cleanup, the aftermath. The knowledge that what was once mine was now only a memory, something I had to fold away and hide. As I moved through the house, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. My hair was flat, my eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. I looked older, somehow, as if the night had added years to my face. I remembered how my father used to tuck my hair behind my ear and call me his brave girl. I tried to summon that bravery now, but it felt thin, worn out at the edges. The day crawled by, each hour stretching longer than the last. My stepmother bustled around, making lists, arranging flowers, preparing for some family dinner she said would be important. Her word heavy with meaning I didn't dare question. My stepsister floated through the rooms, basking in her own reflection, barely noticing the shadow I cast behind her. By evening, I felt emptied out. I watched as my stepmother set the table with her best china, placing the forks and knives with military precision. She hummed under her breath, a brittle, triumphant sound. "This is how a proper family celebrates," she said, as if the last 24 hours had been nothing but ordinary. "Everyone needs to be on their best behavior. We have a guest coming." I wanted to ask who, to ask why, but I knew better than to interrupt her when she was in one of her moods. I nodded, silent as always, and went to my room to change. I stood in front of the closet for a long time, staring at the empty space where my dress once hung. I settled for an old sweater, soft with wear, something that made me feel safe, if not beautiful. The table filled with food: roast chicken, potatoes, green beans glossy with butter. It all looked like a feast from a life I no longer recognized. My stepmother poured wine for herself, lemonade for me. My stepsister sulked, picking at her nails, already bored with her victory. The house felt like a stage, each of us playing our roles. The script written by someone who never cared how the story ended for girls like me. But even as I sat quietly, the ache inside me dulled, replaced by something steadier. I didn't know it yet, but something was about to change. I could feel it in the air, a hush, a tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't realize it then, but that dinner would be the last time I felt powerless in my own home. Sometimes I think people expect anger to be a storm, loud and wild, slamming doors and shouted words. But in my world, anger was something quiet, a low, smoldering thing that pressed down on my lungs and made my voice feel small. I sat through that long afternoon, the weight of the day building inside me, afraid it might crack me open in front of them. My stepmother and stepsister had spent years teaching me how to swallow my feelings, how to keep my head down and survive by staying out of their way. But there are things you can't swallow forever. That evening, as the shadows stretched across the floor and the light began to turn gold, I found myself drifting through memories I wasn't sure were even mine anymore. I saw myself as a little girl, spinning in the living room with my father, our laughter filling the old house before anyone else moved in. I remembered the way he'd let me climb onto his back when the world felt too heavy. How he'd carry me from room to room saying, "You belong here, always, you belong." It was strange how easily the house had forgotten that promise after he left, how quickly it turned cold and foreign, filled with voices that wanted to drown out my own. My stepsister's laughter bounced off the bathroom tiles as she prepared for dinner, humming songs I didn't know. My stepmother called orders from downstairs, always in that clipped tone, as if the whole house existed to serve her. I moved quietly, setting the table just the way she liked, careful not to chip the china or scuff the silver. It was a small act of survival, being useful, being invisible. The habit had worn grooves in me, made me cautious with every movement. When I passed my father's old study, I paused, my hand on the doorframe. The room was always locked now, the key kept on a chain around my stepmother's neck. I wondered if he'd left anything for me inside, or if she'd cleared it all out like she'd cleared out so much else. Sometimes I imagined him sitting at his desk, scribbling letters I'd never read, his voice echoing down the hallway, "Be brave, sweetheart. Don't let them turn you into a ghost." But the ghost feeling lingered. That was the worst of it. Not the cruelty or the coldness, but the feeling of being slowly erased, one small kindness at a time. I watched the light fade outside, the sky streaked with soft blues and fading gold. There was a moment so small I almost missed it when the house seemed to hush, like it knew something was about to happen. My stepmother bustled into the dining room, adjusting the place settings with unnecessary force, her mouth pressed thin. My stepsister followed, her smile brittle, her eyes darting away from mine. We sat at the table, the three of us, with our practiced smiles and strained conversation. My stepmother told stories about her childhood that always seemed to end with her triumphing over someone else's mistake. My stepsister interrupted with tales of the prom, her face lighting up at every compliment she recited, as if she were reliving every moment just to remind me what I'd lost. I let their voices wash over me, nodding when expected, keeping my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. I thought about speaking up, about saying how much that dress meant to me, about telling them what it felt like to be left out, again and again, until even my dreams didn't feel like mine. But the words wouldn't come. I'd learned too well how quickly their laughter turned sharp, how the slightest protest could twist into another lesson about my place in this house. Instead, I let myself drift. I remembered my father's hands, warm and steady, tucking me in at night, promising that I was safe, that I was loved. I tried to gather those memories around me like armor against the loneliness that gnawed at my insides. Dinner dragged on, every minute stretching out, heavy with things unsaid. I caught my reflection in the polished silver, and for a moment, I almost didn't recognize the girl looking back. She looked so tired, so much older than her years, but her eyes still held a glint of something stubborn, a small, stubborn hope that hadn't been stolen yet. When the last dish was cleared, my stepmother sighed in satisfaction. "Everything's just as it should be," she said, as if she could will it into truth. I watched her, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her mask, beneath the control and the careful words. There was fear of losing what she'd taken, fear that all her efforts to push me aside might not be enough. I went to my room, closing the door behind me, and let the silence settle. I sat on the floor and wrapped my arms around my knees, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from downstairs. I breathed in slow, careful breaths, feeling the anger and the grief tangle together, sharp and alive, somewhere deep inside. A shift was happening. It was small, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. The quiet before the storm. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew this. I would endure. I would not be erased. Even if it meant finding a new kind of courage, one that looked like patience, one that sounded like silence, one that waited for the right moment to rise. That night, as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I clung to the faint hope that my story wasn't over yet, that somewhere, somehow, justice might still find me. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that I was worth saving. The days after prom blurred into one another, each morning a repeat of the last. Each night a little colder than before. I used to wake with a sense of expectation, some gentle trace of hope that maybe, today, something would shift, that my father's memory might stretch a protective arm around me, make the air in the house a little softer. But after the dress was taken, even hope felt like a trick I played on myself. My stepmother seemed to sense the change, though she never spoke of it. She moved through the rooms with an extra edge to her voice, barking orders for chores that never seemed to end, correcting the way I folded towels, the way I swept the kitchen, the way I set the table. She didn't need to say out loud that this was not my home anymore. It was written in the way she watched me, as if daring me to make a mistake. My stepsister, freshly anointed with the false glamour of prom, floated through the days with a new, careless cruelty. She wore the dress once more, parading it through the hallway with no intention other than to remind me what had been stolen. It hung from her shoulders like it was meant for someone else, a costume she would soon grow tired of. But not before wringing every drop of pleasure from my pain. I became quieter, if such a thing was possible. I learned to move without making noise, to predict their needs before they spoke them, to disappear into the corners of the house whenever I could. I found solace only in the few things they hadn't claimed: my battered old journal, the faded photo of my father hidden behind a book on the shelf, the way the afternoon sun sometimes slipped through my window and painted the room gold, reminding me that the world outside still existed. I remembered my father's voice most in the silent hours, the way he used to reassure me that kindness mattered, even when it felt invisible. Not all wounds show, he would say, but you don't need to bleed to prove you're hurting. I repeated those words to myself like a prayer, hoping they might build a shield inside me strong enough to withstand the cold. Meals became rituals of exclusion. My stepmother cooked only for herself and her daughter, leaving me to scavenge leftovers after the plates had cooled. They spoke over me, around me, never to me. Their conversations an endless loop of plans I wasn't invited to share. The house echoed with laughter on footsteps, none of them mine. I did what I had always done. I endured. I shrank myself down until I barely cast a shadow, filling my hours with chores, with homework, with whatever I could do to keep my mind from turning on itself. Some evenings I would escape into the backyard, sit under the old oak tree and stare up at the moon, wishing my father could sit beside me just once more, even if only in a dream. If I ever wept, I did it quietly, pressing my face into my pillow so no one would hear. Tears felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. They left me to raw, to exposed, and I couldn't give my stepmother the satisfaction of seeing me break. I watched the days pass in slow procession, my stepmother fussing over her own reflection, my stepsister glued to her phone, her laughter sharp and cruel. There was a kind of comfort in the repetition, as if by following the same patterns, I might keep the worst of the world at bay. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between chores, I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror and barely recognize the girl looking back. Her eyes were wary but not yet empty. There was something in her that refused to die, a small and stubborn flame that no amount of cold could quite smother. It was around this time that my stepmother began preparing for something she wouldn't talk about. She polished the silver, dusted the rooms, rearranged furniture with frantic energy. "We need to present ourselves properly," she said, almost to herself, her voice tight with some hidden anxiety. My stepsister rolled her eyes, but there was a nervousness in the air, an unspoken fear of something outside their control. I felt it too, a strange electricity in the air, as if the house itself was waiting for something to break. Sometimes, I'd find my stepmother standing in the front hallway, fingering the key to my father's study, her mouth set in a grim line. I wanted to ask what she was afraid of, but I didn't dare. I was tired of being punished for questions. One evening, I caught her standing over my father's photograph, the same one I kept hidden in my room. Her fingers brushed his face, her eyes sharp with calculation. She must have sensed me watching because she turned, mask back in place. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" she snapped, and I fled upstairs, heart pounding, the memory of my father's gentle smile chasing away the cold just for a moment. The tension in the house grew thicker, like a storm that wouldn't break. Every sound was amplified, every silence loaded with things unsaid. I knew something was coming, something neither my stepmother nor my stepsister could control or explain away. I felt it in the way their eyes darted around the room, in the hurried way they spoke to each other when they thought I wasn't listening, and in the center of it all, I waited, not with hope. Hope was too fragile, too easily crushed in this house, but with a kind of patience born from pain. Whatever was coming, I would face it. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me crumble. I was my father's daughter. After all, even if they had done everything they could to make me forget it, and somewhere deep inside me, beneath all the hurt and the silence, I began to feel something new, a quiet kind of strength, the stubborn root of resilience growing where nothing else had survived. It's strange how quickly a house can change its skin, how the same walls that watched me grow can suddenly feel like strangers. How a room that once smelled of my father's aftershave now carries only the sharp tang of my stepmother's perfume. The day of the family dinner felt different from the start. There was an urgency to my stepmother's movements, a brittle energy in the way she polished the cutlery. Her lips pursed tight in silent calculations. She barked instructions to my stepsister, who rolled her eyes and sighed but did as she was told. I was given the usual list of chores, each one stacked atop the last, until my hands ached and my legs felt made of stone. Even with the effort I put in, I could tell nothing I did was ever quite right. The napkins weren't folded with enough care, the glasses weren't clean enough, the centerpiece was too plain. My stepmother hovered behind me, correcting and criticizing in the same breath, making sure I knew that even my best wasn't welcome here. My stepsister was more restless than usual, picking at her nails, drifting through the kitchen and dining room in a cloud of boredom and annoyance. Occasionally she'd glance at me, her gaze full of something I could never quite name. Was it pity, or contempt, or just a desire to remind me that I didn't belong? By the time the table was set, my nerves were humming like a plucked string. I retreated to my room for a few stolen moments, pressing my back to the door and breathing in the faint scent of old books and the lavender sachet my father once tucked into my drawer. I looked at myself in the mirror, a pale, tired girl in a faded sweater, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, lips pressed thin to keep in words that would only get me in trouble. For a moment I let myself remember what it was like to feel excited about family dinners. When my father would whistle and joke, and tell stories that filled the room with laughter, those memories felt like stolen light, soft and golden, vanishing as soon as I reached for them. When I went back downstairs, the living room was filled with the forced cheer of people pretending not to be afraid. My stepmother moved through the house with a false briskness, straightening already straight pillows, wiping invisible smudges from the mantel. My stepsister was scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up as if waiting for something to happen. I moved silently among them, more shadow than daughter, my heart beating a frantic, nervous rhythm. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the house took on a dim, honeyed glow. The dinner itself was a performance, my stepmother at the head of the table, my stepsister beside her, and me at the far end as always. The food was lavish: roast beef, potatoes slick with butter, bright green beans and thick slices of bread. I wondered who all this was for. Certainly not for me. My stepmother began talking almost as soon as we sat. Her voice was syrupy, her smile wide and hollow as she boasted about my stepsister's prom night, the compliments, the crown, the so-called friends who admired her dress. My stepsister played along, acting embarrassed by the praise but basking in it all the same. The words washed over me like cold water, each one a reminder of everything I'd lost, everything that had been taken from me without a thought. I focused on my plate, pushing food around with my fork, willing myself not to cry. For a while I tried to fade into the background, but my stepmother kept turning the conversation toward me, almost as if she wanted to rub salt into my wounds. Of course, not everyone can handle the spotlight, she said, raising her glass to her lips. Some people are better suited to the background, don't you think? She looked at me with a thin, pointed smile. My stepsister snickered, covering her mouth, as if the joke was too cruel even for her. I felt the old urge to defend myself, to stand up and tell them what they'd done, how deeply it had hurt, but I swallowed it down, as I always did. Instead, I looked up at my stepmother and met her gaze with a quiet steadiness I didn't know I still possessed. I think people show their true selves when no one is watching, I said softly. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but for a moment, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of doubt, a crack in the wall she kept so carefully built, but she recovered quickly. Waving her hand as if to dismiss me, her laughter tight and false. Oh, listen to her, always the philosopher. She said it like an insult, but I let it hang between us, refusing to look away. The meal dragged on, the tension mounting with every bite. I felt like a knot pulled too tight, about to snap. My stepmother poured herself another glass of wine. My stepsister sulked, and I sat quietly, holding on to that one moment of strength. In the distance, the sound of a car door slamming cut through the evening air, a sharp punctuation mark in the quiet dread. I looked at my stepmother and saw real fear in her eyes. Just for a heartbeat, something was coming, I didn't know what, but I could sense it. A shift in the air, a reckoning that none of us could avoid, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something that almost felt like hope. I'll never forget the sound of that doorbell. It cut through the tense hum of the dinner table like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through every person in the room. My stepmother froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, a look of sharp annoyance flickering across her face. My stepsister immediately straightened, suddenly alert, her phone abandoned on the table as if sensing this wasn't the delivery driver or a neighbor with a borrowed cup of sugar. For a moment, no one moved. I looked between them and felt the strangest sensation, a small, secret satisfaction blooming quietly in my chest. It was as if, after months of swallowing my feelings and shrinking from every confrontation, something outside myself was about to force this family to look up and see me. Or, at least, to see what they had tried so hard to erase. My stepmother finally broke the silence with a forced laugh, her voice edged with nerves. Expecting someone, she asked my stepsister, who only shook her head, eyes wide. Then, that steely authority my stepmother wielded so well returned. Well, whatever it is, I'll handle it. Stay here and don't make a scene. She smoothed her hair, wiped imaginary crumbs from her skirt, and strode down the hallway toward the door. I listened, my body tense as a drawn string, as she opened it. At first, her voice was muffled, a practiced, polite greeting, but then another voice joined hers, low and professional, a tone I didn't recognize. There was a pause, the sound of paper being handled, and then footsteps returning to sets. Not one. The man who followed my stepmother into the dining room was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place against our over-decorated wallpaper and the lingering smell of roast beef. He moved with a calm confidence that filled the room before he even spoke. In his hands was a folder thick with official-looking papers. My stepmother's smile had become rigid, her lips stretched thin over her teeth. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pitched high with fake cheerfulness. The man didn't return her smile. He glanced at each of us, his gaze steady and unreadable, and then addressed me directly. "Are you your name?" he asked. My heart thudded. No one in this house called me by my real name anymore, not unless they were scolding or correcting me. For a moment, I felt small again, like a little girl who had lost her father and was just waiting for someone to tell her everything would be all right. "Yes," I managed, my voice small but clear. He nodded as if that was all he needed to know. "I'm Mr. Barrett. I represent the firm handling your late father's estate." He said this without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I watched as my stepmother's face drained of color, her hands balling into fists beneath the table. "I apologize for arriving during your meal," he continued, his tone respectful but firm. "I tried reaching you earlier, but there was some urgency in concluding the final matters of your father's will." My stepsister shot a look at her mother, her eyes wide with confusion and a growing, greedy curiosity. My stepmother tried to recover, offering a weak, dismissive wave. I thought, all that had been settled ages ago. "I'm sure there's nothing left for us to discuss." Mr. Barrett ignored her attempt to control the room. He laid the folder on the table, opened it, and slid a set of papers toward me. "Actually, there is. Your father left instructions, very clear instructions regarding this house and the assets contained within." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My father had been so careful, so loving in the ways he protected me when he was alive, but after his passing, I had assumed everything he left behind had been claimed by others. Divided up or hidden away, my stepmother had made sure I never felt like anything here belonged to me, not a room, not a dress, not even my own last name. The silence at the table was suffocating. My stepmother's composure had begun to crack. A trembling in her hand, a dart of her eyes toward the papers. "I think this is highly irregular," she said, but her voice quavered. And the usual bite had gone out of it. Barrett only offered a kind, brief smile. "I assure you, everything is legal and binding. It's my duty to make sure your late husband's wishes are followed exactly." I didn't dare look at my stepsister, but I could feel the tension radiating from her, a blend of panic and disbelief, as if the ground had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. My stepmother, still clinging to the performance, straightened in her seat, her voice cold. "We'll review whatever documents you have. But I can assure you, we've managed this house just fine." He nodded, but it was to me he spoke, his words gentle and clear. "Your father wanted to be certain that you were taken care of, that you always had a place that belonged to you, no matter what." The meaning of his words hit me slowly, as if my mind needed time to understand what my heart already hoped was true. A place that belonged to me. Something inside me, something fierce and grateful, began to stir. I pressed my hands together in my lap, holding tight to keep them from shaking, and listened as the dinner and our lives changed with every word. The man, Mr. Barrett, opened the folder, his hands calm and sure. His voice filled the dining room, weaving through the clink of cutlery and the lingering tension like a cool breeze through stale air. I sat there, almost afraid to breathe, watching my stepmother's face twist with every sentence he read. He explained, matter of fact, that my fathers will have specific, unwavering instructions. He read aloud the legal phrases, but what I heard beneath them was my father's voice, steady, certain, trying to reach me from wherever he had gone. "In the event of my death," Mr. Barrett read, "the house and all rights pertaining to it shall be transferred solely to my daughter, solely to my daughter." The words echoed, powerful and surreal. My stepmother tried to interrupt, her voice rising in desperate protest. There must be some mistake. My husband would never. But Mr. Barrett didn't flinch. "These documents are notarized, witnessed, and filed in accordance with the law," he said, looking her directly in the eyes. "Your late husband's intentions are clear." My stepsister's fork clattered to her plate. She looked at me with a confusion I'd never seen before, something almost soft fear. Or maybe just the shock of watching the world slip out from under her. My stepmother's mask cracked. She gripped the table with white knuckles, fighting to keep her composure, but her voice trembled as she spoke. "We've lived here, we've taken care of everything. Surely there's room for—" "No," Mr. Barrett said quietly. "Your husband was very clear. The house is to belong to his daughter alone. The remainder of his estate is minimal. There are no assets for you to contest." For a moment, the room seemed to spin. I stared at my hands, resting small and plain in my lap, and wondered if I'd imagined all of this my whole life. I had been made to feel as though I belonged nowhere, and now, with the careful reading of a will, everything had changed. My father, gone but never truly silent, had left me this last shelter. He had believed in my right to a home, to safety, to dignity. He had made sure that what mattered most, what was meant for me, could not be taken. Not by cruelty. Not by neglect. My stepmother's eyes flashed. "You can't expect us to just leave. Where are we supposed to go?" Her voice, so used to commanding, now sounded desperate and thin. Barrett remained unyielding but not unkind. "You will have a reasonable period to collect your belongings and find alternate accommodations. This is not a surprise to the law, or to anyone who cared to ask. Your husband's wishes are final." My stepsister stared down at her plate, her fingers picking nervously at a napkin. She looked lost. Suddenly a child again. Not the triumphant prom queen she had played so easily the night before. For the first time, she didn't look at me with contempt. Instead, she just looked away. I felt 1,000 emotions ripple through me: relief, sadness, fear, and a bittersweet love for my father, who had done for me in death what he hadn't been able to do in his final days: protect me. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about a promise kept, a final, fierce act of care. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I just sat there, breathing slow and deep, As the weight I'd carried for so long finally began to lift, Barrett turned to me, his expression softening. "You're the sole owner now. If you have any questions, my office will support you." In the transition, he slid a business card across the table. I took it with trembling fingers, unsure how to say thank you for something so big, so life-altering. I looked up at my stepmother and stepsister. For once, they had nothing to say. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not empty, not sad, just honest. Every mask fallen, every lie exposed to the cold, clear light. I finally understood what my father meant about kindness and quiet strength. Even in the face of injustice, even in the ache of loss, he had made sure I would not be invisible. My place in this world was not something they could steal. And in that hush, as Mr. Barrett gathered his papers and stood to leave, I realized that the worst was not behind me, but neither was my strength. After Mr. Barrett's words faded into the silence, it was as if a spell had broken in the room. A long, unspoken truth finally said aloud, the ugly secrets and careful lies dissolving in the harsh light of reality. For a moment, no one moved. I saw the color drain from my stepmother's face. Her lips parted, hands clenched so tightly around her napkin that the veins in her wrists stood out blue and trembling. My stepsister stared down at the tablecloth, her expression a strange mix of shock and something like grief. Her shoulders hunched in on themselves as if she were trying to become invisible. There was nothing left for them to say. Every argument, every protest, every denial seemed to wither in the face of that legal, irrefutable truth. My stepmother, who had always prided herself on control, on her ability to bend any situation to her will, suddenly looked so small in the high-backed dining chair. She kept opening her mouth, as if to challenge Mr. Barrett, but no words would come. I wondered if she finally understood what it meant to be powerless, if even for a moment she could taste the same helplessness she'd served to me all these years. I didn't gloat. I couldn't. The victory felt too raw, too complicated, edged with both relief and sadness. I wanted to hate them for what they'd done, for every time they'd turned me into a ghost in my own home. But all I felt was an aching kind of release. I could see in that moment the cracks in my stepmother's armor, the fear in her eyes, the way her bravado evaporated when it was no longer fed by someone else's pain. It was almost pitiful, the way she kept glancing at my stepsister for some kind of rescue, but none came. My stepsister, so often my rival, was suddenly just another lost girl. Stripped of her borrowed dress and her borrowed power, she wouldn't meet my gaze. She didn't have to. I understood now that she had never really been stronger than me. She had just been protected, insulated by her mother's schemes, handed things that had cost me everything to lose. I felt a flash of something like pity, quickly followed by exhaustion. There would be no apologies, no sudden confessions of guilt. We were past the point of reconciliation, and maybe we had always been. Barrett gathered his papers and quietly excused himself, leaving behind the finality of the moment and the keys to my future. His footsteps faded down the hallway, the front door opening and closing with a click that seemed to echo through every room of the house. For a few heartbeats, I just sat there, letting it all sink in, the weight of what had changed. And what hadn't. My stepmother finally found her voice, but it was smaller than I had ever heard it, trembling and thin. "You can't mean this," she whispered, but she was speaking more to herself than to me. "This house, it's all we have. Where will we go? What will we do?" She looked at me not as a rival, but as someone who could answer her prayers, and I saw for the first time the desperation beneath all her cruelty. She had fought so hard to own something that was never hers. My stepsister sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, and whispered, "Mom, let's just go." Her voice was resigned, tired in a way that made her seem much younger than before. For so long, she'd been the favored child, protected by a wall of entitlement. Now, for the first time, she was just as lost as I had been. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I looked at my stepmother and stepsister, feeling a quiet power. I'd never known one that came not from anger or revenge, but from simple, undeniable truth. My father had not abandoned me. He had found a way to speak for me, to shield me. Even when I'd lost the will to defend myself, I wanted to say something, to offer some comfort or closure, but the words would not come. I realized it wasn't my job to heal them, or to fix the broken places they carried with them. For once, I was allowed to let go. I could choose dignity, even if they could not. As I rose from the table, my legs unsteady but my heart strangely calm, I finally met my stepmother's gaze. There was no anger left in me, no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that I belonged here, and that her hold over me was gone. In the end. There was no great scene, no shouting, no tearful apologies. Just three women, sitting in the ruins of what used to be a family, each of us facing the truth in our own way. The power had shifted. And I realized that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply hold your ground and let the truth speak for itself. That night, for the first time since my father died, I slept without fear. The house was quieter than I'd ever known it, the air heavy with all the things that could never be unsaid. My stepmother lingered by the dining room table long after Mr. Barrett left, her eyes fixed on the papers he'd brought, as if staring hard enough might change the words or bring my father back to answer for them. My stepsister wandered in and out of rooms, gathering her things with a kind of numb efficiency, her face blotchy, her silence broken only by the occasional sniffle. I watched them move through the house, this place that had held our lives together by the most fragile of threads, and felt a strange tenderness and sorrow. Even for the people who had made me feel so small. I found my stepmother in the living room, her hands wrapped tightly around a framed photo of my father and me, one I'd hidden long ago, only for her to claim it as her own in her silent campaign to erase my place here. She looked up when she realized I was there, her face streaked with tears she couldn't disguise. For the first time, I saw her not as the villain who'd stolen my dress, my hope, my sense of safety, but as a woman who'd lost the fight to keep what was never truly hers. Her pain was real, and so was mine. For a moment, we simply stared at one another, two women who'd both been left behind in different ways, neither of us whole, neither of us the winner. I could have raised my voice then, could have demanded apologies and explanations, could have unleashed every hurt and every wrong I'd ever endured under her roof. But the words stayed quiet in my chest, because I realized none of it would change the past or heal the broken parts of either of us. My dignity didn't require an audience. I was not here to humiliate her, only to finally claim what had always been mine: a home, a future, and the right to exist without fear. In a voice as steady as I could manage, I spoke. "I think it's time for you and your daughter to leave," I said, each word measured and soft, but carrying the weight of a lifetime. "I won't keep you from gathering your things. Take what you need, and go with whatever grace you can. I don't want to fight anymore. This house was meant for peace, and I want to remember it that way." My stepmother closed her eyes and clutched the photograph tighter, her breath shuddering in her chest. "Your father, he never told me," she said at last, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "He never said he would leave it all to you." I nodded. "He did what he thought was right. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe none of us are. But this," I looked around the room, my childhood memories crowding the edges, "this is where I have to start over, and I think you need a chance to start over somewhere else." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching mine, for anger, for triumph, for something sharp, but all she found was the steady resolve of someone who had learned, painfully and slowly, to survive by keeping her heart soft. Even in a world that demanded armor, my stepsister stood at the doorway, watching, her hands trembling as she clutched a battered backpack to her chest. There was no defiance left in her, just a tired resignation and maybe, beneath it, a glimmer of understanding. For the first time in her life, they moved through the house quietly, gathering what little they could call their own. My stepmother paused by the door, still holding the photograph, and finally set it on the hallway table, as if she'd remembered it did not belong to her. She looked back at me, her mouth opening and closing on words she could not form, then nodded once, a gesture as close to apology as she would ever come. My stepsister hesitated at the threshold, her gaze meeting mine for just a moment. "I'm sorry about the dress," she whispered, voice hoarse and small. "I'm sorry about everything." And then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the porch steps into the cool evening. I closed the door behind them with trembling hands, leaning against the wood as the house finally exhaled. It was over, not just the battle for a home, but the battle to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. I pressed my forehead against the door and breathed deeply, letting all the pain and fear and bitterness slip from my body like a heavy coat. There was no triumph, no victory parade, only a profound and lasting quiet. But it was a quiet I had chosen, A quiet I could finally fill with something new, my own voice, my own dreams, the life my father had wanted for me. In the hush of that moment, I realized I had never lost my dignity. It had been with me all along, waiting for me to speak it into existence. The house felt impossibly large and silent once they were gone. I wandered through the rooms on unsteady feet, my hand trailing along the walls and familiar corners, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me or a sharp voice calling my name. But it was only me, and the gentle creaks and sighs of an old house, settling into itself after too many years of holding its breath. Every space felt both strange and intimate, rooms reclaimed from memory, echoes of laughter and argument, and all the ordinary days that had slipped past while I was trying to disappear. I picked up the framed photograph my stepmother had left behind. My father's smile stared back at me, the kind that always promised safety and love. I held it close, sinking into the couch as the dusk settled blue and soft outside the windows. For a long time, I simply sat there, letting my thoughts drift. I thought of the dress, ruined and discarded, and realized it didn't matter anymore. Not really. What I had lost could never compare to what had been returned to me: the right to choose, the right to exist in peace, the simple, fierce gift of being allowed to dream again. The pain of the past lingered, not as a sharp edge but as something that softened me, made me real. I knew there would be hard days ahead, loneliness, and maybe regret. There would be mornings when I missed even the sound of voices that never spoke to me with kindness, and nights when the house felt too empty, the quiet to complete. But I also knew that I would fill these rooms with new life, new memories that belonged to me and no one else. I walked upstairs to my old room, sunlight slanting in golden lines across the worn floorboards. I opened the closet and looked at the empty space where the dress had hung for so long. I didn't feel angry or bitter anymore. Instead, I felt something I hadn't known in years: peace. I pulled out my battered journal and began to write, not about sorrow, but about possibility, the small, shy hopes I'd never dared to voice, the garden I might plant in spring, the friends I could invite for laughter that belonged here, the quiet assurance that I had survived, not just the cruelty, but the long silence afterward. As night fell, I lit a candle and carried it to the mantel. I placed my father's photo at the very center and whispered a thank you, more prayer than confession. "You kept your promise," I said softly. "You didn't let them erase me." I stood in the middle of my home and let the quiet wrap around me, not as a punishment, but as a comfort. For the first time, the silence felt like mine, filled with the echo of my own breath, the gentle certainty of my heart beating steady and whole. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's life. I was my father's daughter, the quiet star he had always seen, shining through the darkness. There would be more to this story: days of rebuilding, forgiving, learning to trust myself again. But for tonight, it was enough to exist in the warmth of my own making, to look out the window at the world waiting beyond the glass, and know that whatever came next, I would meet it with the same quiet strength that had brought me here. And in that hush, I finally believed I was home.